Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
Today, we're doing what we do best, getting straight to the core insights from some really interesting research.
Yeah, and this time we're looking at papers from the third session of the virtual summer school in entrepreneurship research 2025.
That's right. And it's quite an initiative, isn't it?
It really is. Big thanks are due here to Professor Vishal K. Gupta and PhD candidate Athena Skiadopoulou at the University of Alabama. They've spearheaded this.
Absolutely. It's a no-fee summer school, been running since 2021, so this is the 5th year.
5 sessions, 4 papers each, sometimes book reviews too. Just a great resource for the field.
Totally agree. And the session we're unpacking today, it really caught our eye. It's all about family firms.
Yes, a huge part of the global economy.
Exactly. We'll be digging into things like gender dynamics in leadership and how that affects the bottom line.
And also their strategic habits, how they tend to operate.
Right. And even some of the less shiny aspects like dysfunctional behavior. The sources are top-notch management science, ET&P, Family Business Review.
So solid academic grounding.
Definitely. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. So family firms, they're everywhere, right? The Amore paper from 2014 really emphasizes this.
The most common structure globally.
Even in places like the U.S. with big public companies, families often still hold, significant sway. Their study looks specifically at Italian family firms, medium and large ones, between 2000 and 2010.
And they found something pretty striking about women in leadership roles, didn't they?
They did. The key finding was about profitability. It went up in firms with female CEOs if there were also more female directors on the board.
Okay, so it's an interaction effect, not just one or the other.
Precisely. A female CEO on her own didn't guarantee higher profits in their data. It was the combination.
And they were pretty rigorous about checking this.
Oh, yeah. They used what's called a triple difference approach, plus other methods like propensity score matching and instrumental variables. Basically, lots of statistical tools to try and pin down if this link was causal and not just, correlation.
Gotcha. So trying to rule out other explanations.
Exactly. And like you said, it's an interaction. But there were nuances, too.
Oh, like what?
Well, this positive effect. It was weaker in places where there were strong, societal biases against women in leadership roles.
Okay, so context matters.
Definitely. And it was also less pronounced in really large firms, maybe different dynamics there.
Interesting. But where it did hold was the impact significant, like in real money terms.
They calculated that. For firms with female CEOs, having at least half the board be female, that correlated with about a 0.9 percentage point bump in operating profitability.
Wow, okay, that's not trivial at all. That's a noticeable difference.
Absolutely. And maybe the most interesting twist. The biggest profit boosts came when you had a female CEO from the controlling family working with female directors who were not related to the family.
Huh. Family CEO, but outside directors. Why do you think that specific mix works so well?
Well, you could speculate, right? Maybe the family CEO brings that deep-rooted understanding, the long-term view, the values.
The industry.
Exactly. And then the unrelated female directors. They bring potentially fresh perspectives, maybe stronger governance, different networks, objective viewpoints.
Like the best of both worlds. Insider knowledge plus outsider scrutiny.
Kind of. And perhaps the shared gender helps foster, better communication or alignment on certain issues. It suggests a really interesting dynamic for governance.
It really does. Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Strategic persistence. This comes from the Fang and colleagues paper in 2021. It sounds, like sticking to your guns, strategically speaking.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, they draw on behavioral theory. The core idea is that family firms are often less likely to make big strategic changes, what the paper calls strategic renewal.
And why is that? What's the thinking?
It boils down to the family's goals. Things like maintaining the family tradition, keeping the legacy going. Also, often a focus on being careful with money parsimony, they call it.
Right, protecting the core, maybe being a bit more risk-averse than a non-family firm might be?
Potentially, yeah. They prefer stability, sticking with what's known, what's worked. It's about preserving the family's control and wealth over the long haul.
Okay, and did the data back this up?
It seems so. They looked at a lot of firms, S&P 1500 manufacturers, over a pretty long period, 1996 to 2013. And they found that, yes, on average, family firms showed significantly more strategic persistence than the non-family firms in the sample.
Okay, so they changed key strategies less often or less drastically?
Correct. And it wasn't even uniform across all family firms.
How so?
It was even more noticeable in firms where the founder was still around and involved, or where a family member was the chairman or the CEO.
So strong family leadership really leans into that persistence.
It seems like it reinforces that tendency, yeah.
So when they say strategic persistence, how do they actually, measure that? It sounds a bit abstract.
Good question. They didn't just ask CEOs, are you persistent? They looked at concrete data over 5-year windows.
Okay, like what kind of data?
Things like how much the company's spending varied year to year on advertising intensity, R&D intensity.
Investment levels?
Exactly. Also, the newness of their plants and equipment, non-production overhead costs, inventory levels, even how much debt they carried, their financial leverage.
So they looked at the consistency of these strategic choices over time. Less variation equals more persistence.
You got it. The standard deviation of those metrics over 5 years was their measure. Lower standard deviation meant higher persistence.
Okay, that makes sense. And this connects to the idea that family firms often have a longer time horizon, right?
It could well be a reflection of that. The study provides the empirical evidence for the persistence itself, rather than just theorizing about the long-term view. But they definitely seem related.
But is being persistent always a good thing? Couldn't it mean they get stuck in their ways, maybe miss opportunities or adapt too slowly?
That's the potential downside, absolutely. The researchers acknowledge it. This persistence might hold back corporate entrepreneurship, the big strategic shifts.
Right, less renewal.
But they also float this intriguing idea, innovation through tradition.
Innovation through tradition, how does that work?
The idea is that some family firms might innovate within their existing strategy. They stick to their core, but find ways to improve, adapt incrementally, maybe refine processes or offerings without totally changing direction.
So evolution rather than revolution, perhaps. Staying true to the core, but still moving forward.
Exactly. It's not necessarily stagnation, but it's a different approach to growth and change.
Okay, interesting contrast. Now let's dive into something maybe a bit darker, but definitely important. Dysfunctional behavior in family firms. This is from that big review by Kidwell and colleagues, right? 2024.
Yes, a really comprehensive piece. They looked at 160 articles across different fields to get a handle on, the bad side of family business.
And how did they define dysfunctional behavior? It sounds like it could cover a lot.
It does. Their definition is pretty broad. Basically, any willful workplace behavior that breaks norms or harms individuals, the family, the company, or other stakeholders.
Okay, can you give some examples of what kinds of things fall under that?
Sure. The review covers quite a range. Things like counterproductive work behavior, just general slacking off or undermining things. Then there's bifurcation bias.
Bifurcation bias, what's that?
It's treating family employees differently, usually better than non-family employees, unfair advantages, that kind of thing.
Ah, okay. That sounds familiar. What else?
Well, the more obvious stuff, too. Nepotism, actual theft, bullying, gender discrimination, financial misconduct, fraud.
Wow.
Yeah. Even bribery, corruption, tax evasion, and corporate social irresponsibility. It's a pretty extensive list. Shows family firms aren't immune.
Clearly not. So, looking across all that research, what were the main takeaways from the review? Did they see any patterns in how this is studied?
One big observation was that a lot of the research focuses on what happens inside the firm, the immediate triggers, the behaviors themselves.
Okay.
But there's been less focus on, say, the family dynamics before people join the business, long-standing rivalries or issues that then spill over.
Right, the baggage they bring in.
Exactly. And also maybe less focus on external pressures, industry norms, economic stress that might contribute.
That makes sense. So what did the research identify as potential causes or antecedents?
Several things came up frequently. Certain personality traits like the dark triad, narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy.
Oof.
Individual attitudes, too, like a sense of entitlement or excessive pride, feeling pressured at work, lots of conflict. Nepotism itself can be a cause as well as a behavior.
And hang on, you mentioned socio-emotional wealth earlier. How does that fit in? Isn't that usually seen as a positive for family firms?
Yeah, this is a really subtle but important point from the review. Socio-emotional wealth that focus on family control, identity, legacy, emotional attachment.
The non-financial stuff.
Right. Sometimes the drive to protect that can actually lead to dysfunctional behavior.
How so?
Like maybe you exclude a really talented non-family manager to keep control within the family. Or maybe you cover up unethical behavior to protect the family's reputation. The desire to preserve SCW can sometimes override purely rational or even ethical business decisions.
I see. So the very thing that makes them unique can also create vulnerabilities or justifications for bad actions. That's complex.
It is. The lines get blurry.
And the consequences. What did the research say about the impact of all this?
They looked at impacts at different levels. For individuals, it means things like lower morale, people quitting more often, less job satisfaction. Predictable stuff, really.
Sure.
For the family itself, it obviously causes conflict, damaged relationships. For the firm, you see hits to performance, reputation damage, legal troubles.
And wider effects.
Yeah, potentially eroding ethical norms in the industry, damaging social trust. It ripples outwards.
The review also mentioned something about perspective, didn't it? That dysfunctional can be in the eye of the beholder sometimes.
Right. This is tricky. Take nepotism. From a purely corporate governance view, it looks bad, right? Unfair.
Usually, yeah.
But within some family firms, it might be seen as ensuring loyalty, keeping trusted people in key roles, maintaining the family vision.
So a potential justification, even if outsiders wouldn't agree.
Exactly. Or even something like bribery in some really tough environments. A family might rationalize it as necessary for the business's survival, protecting everyone's jobs, family and non-family alike. Doesn't make it right, but shows the complex motivations.
Definitely highlights the need for strong ethical frameworks within these firms. Did the review suggest where research should go next?
Yeah, they pointed to bringing in more insights from, say, family science or psychology, looking at things like sibling rivalry, parenting styles, how those play out in the business context.
Understanding the family system better.
Precisely. And also considering cultural differences more. What's considered normal or dysfunctional can vary a lot across societies.
Makes sense. And just quickly, we should also acknowledge that Bennedsen study from 2007. We don't have a ton of detail on it here, but it looked at CEO transitions in Danish family firms.
Right. Another critical piece of the puzzle. Leadership changes are always a big deal, but especially in family firms with all the succession issues, emotional ties.
Preserving the legacy.
Exactly. That study adds to understanding how performance shifts around those key transition points.
Okay, so pulling all of this together, if you had to summarize the big picture on family firms from these studies for our listeners, what would you say?
I'd say the main thing is they're complicated. Seriously, though, they're not monolithic. We see that gender dynamics at the very top matter for the bottom line, but it's about the interaction and the context.
Right, not just ticking a box.
Then there's strategy. They do tend towards persistence, sticking with things, likely driven by those long-term family goals. That can be good for stability, maybe bad for radical adaptation.
A double-edged sword.
Kind of. And finally, the internal dynamics. Well, the close ties between family and business can be a huge strength, but also create openings for a whole range of dysfunctional behaviors, often tangled up with both family history and business pressures.
And it's worth reminding everyone, these aren't just opinions. This comes from deep academic research presented at the virtual summer school. Evidence-based stuff.
Absolutely. Rigorous work.
So hopefully, for everyone listening, this deep dive gave you some solid insights, maybe a few aha moments, without feeling like you just read a textbook.
Yeah, and it leaves us with a big question, really. Thinking about this mix, the tradition, the persistence, the potential for dysfunction, what do you think is the single biggest challenge facing family businesses today in the 21st century?
That's a good one.
And maybe how can understanding these family business dynamics better actually help them perform better and act more ethically? Something to mull over.
Definitely food for thought. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.